All right,
All right.
let's go ahead and start our class. So, for a couple weeks, we've talked about this idea of people deconstructing their faith. And we also were talking, we were talking about, yeah, but what about when they start reconstructing it? And so I was thinking this week about what do we say about helping people reconstruct their faith? And I really think it has, we can talk about the deconstruction and then the reconstruction. We can talk about them as if they're separate, but they are intertwined. And I really believe that how we respond to someone who's deconstructing their faith has everything to do with how the reconstruction will go. In other words, I don't need to think, well, right now we're in the deconstruction, but then we're going to get to that reconstruction. No, the way we react to someone saying, I've got some serious questions here. Right there at that moment, I just don't know if I can really believe the miracles, or I don't know if what I can make sense of this or that. How we respond right there has everything to do with the reconstruction that may or may not occur later, right? I don't need to think, well, we'll get to reconstruction. My guess is also, if we're anxious about the other person's question, with their doubt, with their thoughts, then we want to hurry them through to reconstructing something. And that could be the worst thing we could do.
Greg this morning in children's time did a great job with that. But when the little kids started saying, well, I don't know if that word is going to come in there. I don't know if that word should stay there. I thought, Greg, you started this.
They're questioning the book.
Yeah.
So right, I think we have to realize we can't be too anxious. Yeah, we can't be too anxious. We can't try and push things along so we can feel more at ease. We need to learn to be just calm down and let the process occur. I mentioned this the first week. A lot of it comes down to whether we have confidence in the working of the Holy Spirit. I really think we do. If we can say, look, God's working in all of this. I don't need to be uptight. Yeah, it's a little disconcerting that this person is questioning everything I believe. And if it's your child, everything I've ever taught them. Okay, that is disconcerting. But if I have a real belief in the working of the Holy Spirit, then I can just relax and say, God doesn't need me to jump into action right now. God needs me to just listen. And like I was saying, listen, affirm the validity of what they're saying, go ahead and, even further that, where you say, yeah, not only that, but these are some issues. I understand the issues, right? So really, I'm suggesting we think about all of that as really part of the reconstruction. It begins with how you respond to their question or their doubt or their kind of suggesting, I might just throw all this out. And how you respond in that moment will have a lot to do whether anything can be reconstructed, right? So I'm going to use this little diagram, and I'm using it from this. Here's a passage we're probably familiar with from Colossians 4, verse 6. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone. Right? Sometimes the way you ought to answer someone is not to give them an answer. That may seem a little counterintuitive, but think of it not as answer like I have to have a solution to offer. Think of answer as respond, right? Like if someone says, well, I'm not sure I believe that, you don't have to have an answer why they ought to believe that. You have to have a gracious way of responding. How do you answer someone who's saying, I don't know if I'm really believing that? I don't think an answer means a contradictory argument in the other direction. I think it's knowing how to speak in that moment. And I say the way to speak, as I've suggested, is to say, that's a really good point. And I understand that. Or even if you personally don't understand that, you say, I could see how you could be thinking that way. You know, it's like, I can see that, why that would raise real questions for you. Okay, so-
Sometimes if you don't say anything, though, it leaves the door open. Yeah.
right, right. That's why, yeah, it's not like starting to try and push back. It's to listen and to elicit, to even say, yeah, well, tell me why you think that. Oh, okay, with non-judgmental listening. Where they start realizing, okay, so I was thinking I was gonna get jumped on. And you know what? I didn't get jumped on. So, yeah, just listen. Someone listened to me, yeah.
Okay, so. I know I'm jumping out here, but that's how I am. So I was listening to a lady describe how Indians are treated in North Carolina in a very preferential way. They're getting, some money every month and various things, and it was making me really anxious because, we all know that I'm bleeding heart liberal to start with. And then you add on to that, I have Indians in my heritage and, so I'm getting ready to jump on this situation. But I didn't. I just listened because I didn't know exactly what to say. And I'm telling a friend of mine who is involved in politics, and I said, should I have said? And she said, okay, when I get in situations like that, what I do is, first of all, I say, tell me more. And she said, then second, I keep after they've told me more and more and more, she said, I try to answer with 3 words. And she said, in your situation, I would have said, tell me more. And then to finish up the conversation from my standpoint, I would have said, they were here first.
Hmm.
What a great answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't think of that. I didn't think of me that I was gonna go on for 30 minutes with the diatribe, And so I'm trying to think about that. Tell me more. There's a reason why this person feels bad about this situation, resentful, and then finishing up with a 3-word answer. If I have to give an answer, that's so helpful. So that has helped me a lot.
Okay, yeah, that's a good example. So what I want to lay out for us here is a kind of pattern that I think is a gracious way to have dialogue, how to have gracious dialogue. So there's this little grid. So on the left column, that's your position. That's what you hold to. The right column is this other person, what they're saying, right? And then there are things I would say that are right about both positions and things that are wrong about both positions. I would just say that because none of us are infallible. Whatever position I hold is not a perfect and irrefutable and infallible position. Whatever I'm holding, there's some weaknesses to it. There's some I don't knows or I got it wrong, right? So in a generous dialogue, in a gracious dialogue, what do? Here's what typically happens. Somebody says, here's what's wrong with their position, and here's what's right with my position. Right? You can basically hear that anywhere on the news. Right?
Right.
And depending on which station you're listening to, it's one way or the other way, but that's pretty much what they're doing. Everything wrong with the other position, everything right with our position. Not talking about those 2 quadrants at all. Not going to admit anything's wrong with our position, not going to admit anything's right with theirs. It's just, okay. And of course, we know what happens is the other person does the same thing. And that's where that gets us, right? You're talking past each other, right? So the other person's the other line talking about what's wrong with your position and what's right with theirs. You're talking about what's wrong with theirs and what's right with yours. Not going to get anywhere, right? It's just going to set up a nice argument. Nobody's going to come to a new understanding or be enlightened. We're just arguing. That's pretty much what our society does, right? But I'm going to suggest something that I think is really very biblical. I would say this is what we ought to do. You start with and this is what I was talking about. Someone says, "Oh, I don't know that I believe in the Bible as the inspired word of God." And you could do like Linda's saying is, "Well, tell me more." And they explain why. And then you start over here with what's right about their position. You got some valid points. No doubt about it. You know, well, this is an ancient text. It's been through lots of processes, and we got all kinds of manuscripts, and there's all sorts of uncertainty. And I would say those are some valid points. It is an ancient text that has been translated. And there's all kinds of versions of it, and there's uncertainties about it. You got some valid. So you start the conversation, not what's wrong with what they're doing, but what's right.
Yeah.
Where do you go next? Where do you go next in the conversation? What's wrong with your position? Right? That's where you go next. You got some good points, and I've got to confess some things. Yeah. So if they're saying, I think the church is hypocritical, you got some valid points, and you know what? I need to confess some of that hypocrisy. And it's not just the church, me, myself, and we're hypocritical too. I don't always do everything I say, right? I don't always live up to even what I espouse. So you've got good points, and I've got faults. That's where you go second. Okay. Now, but usually by this point, the other person has been taken off guard because they expected you to start in the bottom corner. What's wrong with what they're saying? They didn't expect you to validate, and then they didn't expect you to confess, right? To own up to not being right about everything, right? So now they're getting taken a little off guard. Now, where you go is you say, well, perhaps there is what I would call a new vision, a way of understanding things. You know, so I've got something but that's when I'm invited. I also made that point, right? Listen non-judgmentally, affirm, all those sorts of things. And when invited, respond. When the person finally says, so if you agree with my good points and you know that things are wrong, why in the world are you still a Christian? Well, now I've been invited. Well, here's how I have this new vision, a new way of looking, a new perspective, how I work it out, acknowledging you've got valid points and things are screwed up, but here's how I put it together. Not perfectly, don't have all the answers, but that's where I go, right? And we're done. You don't ever go down to the quadrant. There's no point in going there and trying to point all the problems out with what they think, because that will build defensiveness, resistance, and it'll shut down the dialogue. How do you know it'll shut down the dialogue? Because if someone does that to you, what do you want to do? Shut down the dialogue. That's me, right? If someone starts jumping on me and criticizing everything's wrong, not acknowledging what I said that might have had some validity, the first thing they do is go down there and they start harping there. I don't want to talk anymore. Thank you very much. I don't need that. Okay. So if we don't enjoy it when people do it, then no one else is. You don't ever have to go down there. If you do this, and that is powerful enough, you never have to go there. Right? You don't have to go there. They will put it together and they'll go, okay. Okay. So I think that's the way.
Got a convert.
But yeah,
Oh, when they think I'm a contract.
They're not.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's the approach. Now, let's line that up with Jesus. Does Jesus use that approach? Now, I think it's very possible to say, I don't think Jesus used that approach at all. If I was going to say Jesus isn't using that approach, where do we say we might think Jesus is going here all the time?
Woman at the well.
Yeah, but I think there's a better, kind of. I think there's a real good example of Jesus going here, or we think he's going there.
The scripture from Romans that we read this morning, where the lady came and asked him to heal her daughter.
Okay. Yeah, but
All the Pharisees. and-
okay, all the Pharisees, there's what I'm looking for, right? Isn't he always going here, you Pharisees, you're doing everything wrong, right? Isn't that? Okay,
Yeah.
because these other ones are, I think we could handle, but they're less egregious, apparently, you know what I'm saying? I mean, if we're gonna hold up a real incident and say, I don't think this is what Jesus does, because great, Jesus is always going to that corner with the Pharisees. Why is it not that corner? Because Jesus, when he criticizes the Pharisees, he's down here. That's his group, right? They're not some other group. That's his group. He goes to temple. He goes to synagogue. He keeps the law. And when he's saying we are doing a horrible job of keeping the law, he's not talking about the Gentiles, some other group. He's confessing the fault in his own deeply held faith of Judaism. Does that make sense? He's not, because now if we go to the times when he's talking with Gentiles, where he talks with the Samaritan woman.
Maybe I misunderstood. I was saying, he said you had valid lost to do stone, but you without sin, pick up the stone, throw it first. So he tells them what they did wrong, or what is wrong with that thinking. It's not, he doesn't say that, he just says what is wrong with that thinking.
Yeah.
And gives them to do it. That's what he wants.
Right. And you're, so yeah, I would say he's giving that often, right? But to me, the analog comparison of our position versus another person's position. So we're talking about a situation where we're a believer and someone else is saying, I don't believe what you believe, right? I'm questioning that. I think that the parallel is not when he's talking to the Pharisees. That's when he's saying, and he'll even say he'll say the Pharisees get some things right. When they sit in the law in the seat of Moses, listen to them. Right? He acknowledges when the Pharisees do some things right. But that's a dialogue with them. But when he's down here criticizing, that's his own group he's criticizing. Right. So someone last week was saying, yeah, but it sounds like if you start agreeing with the person about faults in your group, you're like casting stones at your own group. And I'm like, but I think that's what Jesus is doing. Like if a Greek were to come to Jesus and say, I don't know, you Jews seem like you got a lot of things wrong, I think he would have said, you're correct. You look at the Pharisees, you look at the chief priests, the group I'm a part of has got a lot of things wrong, and I'm not alleging it's not full of problems. And our temple practice is completely gone off the rails. But that's criticizing his own tradition. That makes sense. That's where I was trying to say. I think Jesus is doing. Now Jesus will, to various instances, he will offer something new to somebody, right? Who a perspective, a vision, a new way of looking at things, whether it's the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, whether it's the woman caught in adultery, whether it's the Canaanite woman, he'll offer a new perspective. But I'd say once again, I don't see him living down like in this corner. The only people he tends to do that with are the Pharisees, but that's on his part, right? That's the only people he really rakes over the coals, but that's his group, right? Okay. So other thoughts, comments, what? Yes.
Should gracious dialogue look different for someone who is infallible?
You mean God?
I mean, of course, Jesus is our model.
Yeah.
And of course, we want to model what Jesus does, but in this instant, I'm just thinking like, he's different than me.
He offers endless mercy. You know?
Yeah, that would be some of the. Well, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that we can say on this point Jesus isn't the one we're going to model. I mean, I don't know what else to do but to walk as he walked. Even in this, to me, I think the little paradigm, the little thing works, right? I think it's wise. I think it is what you do when you're generous and gracious and merciful. Now, like I said, trying to look at the gospel and say, when is Jesus? I'm not sure you find Jesus very often talking to someone who's not a Jew, who's genuinely of a different whole tradition. A few times he does, but he never says, well, you pagans are out there worshiping dead idols. He never goes there. He could, but he does, right? The few times he interacts with someone of a totally different, most of it's his own group inner dialogue. He's dialoguing with his countrymen, with his fellow believers about the faith. But when he interacts with somebody who's not of a Jewish faith, I don't see him ever saying anything there. He might say something like, no greater faith have I found in all of Israel than this person. Whoa, that's a Gentile. That was a Roman soldier you just interacted with, said, great faith. Did he say, yeah, but he's a pagan? Never went there to say, yeah, but he worships the Roman gods. Never went there. He said, great faith. Y'all could learn something from it, right? He criticizes his own group. Y'all could learn something from this guy. You know, again, I just think it works for Jesus. You just have to think through those gospel events, those incidences, and say, is that what he's modeling for? Okay, John, go ahead, Jim.
You know, I think one thing to think about is in some of those stories where Jesus is dogging the Pharisees, really who is speaking to? It really may not be the Pharisees, right? He's talking, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisee, well, he's not talking directly to the Pharisees here too.
Right.
You may be agreeing with the people that are out there. I agree, they're putting on burdens that are too high. But those aren't the right burdens to be placed on the dialogue. He's using Pharisees, but he's speaking to people.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And a lot of that is casting a new vision, right? It's in the midst of that he's saying, the Pharisees are saying this, but I'm saying to you, do this, right? He's trying to, yeah, he might know that a lot of the Pharisees are hopeless cases in terms of they're not going to listen to him. They're conspiring to get him killed. So he's kind of given up there, but he's talking to the people saying, yeah, you hear them saying this, but I'm telling you, live this way. Yeah.
And, you know, maybe he's speaking to the Pharisees too, in fact, that that's the mercy that they need sometimes. Five point you humble. Your point from the last meeting. So but the dialogue really may be to not to them.
Yeah, right. And I guess I could extend this a little bit, right? I could make a dotted line that goes down here that says, when invited, you might be able to go there. Right? When invited. Because again, I would think in the case with the Pharisees are coming to him all the time, inviting the conversation, picking the fight. Right? So again, it's not uninvited that he goes to the Pharisees and tries to straighten them out and says what's wrong. They've come and they've raised the question and and they're asking him. And so you could say, well, it is his own group, but in terms of the Pharisees here, or he's here, he goes there, but that's when invited, when they've initiated the conversation. And I guess there might, again, in the analog for us, I would start with someone who's raising questions, validated, saying they've got lots of good points. When invited, start talking more about this than that. But there may be an occasion in talking about this that you do some contrasting with that. Right? But that's only after you've been given the wide open invitation, will help me figure out then how you look at, now that they're not going to be defensive because they're asking you to share your thoughts. And you could say, well, yeah, in sharing my thoughts, here's why I see that may make up for what a deficiency I see in how you look at things, right? But you didn't jump on the deficiency, right? And I think usually people aren't nearly as defensive when they've already been listened to, they've already been validated, you've already said all these things are wrong and a big confessional. Then if you can get to the point where you're actually starting to have a constructive dialogue, then you can say, well, here's some of the problems I see. If you look at it that way, I see this as a problem and I'm suggesting this is a solution. Well, see that at that point, they're not defensive, right? They're more like curious, interested.
Sorry, what- I think, I think this box, sometimes it's kind of how I listen, which means I'm really not listening, because I'm trying to move them to my position. Here's the way to do that. Or maybe I really should start by listening to truly see if there's something I can learn. It's not about moving them to another position, but maybe I need to be moving. I really do want to not tell me more so I can learn more ways. Your position, but more ways to really learn if there's something I could learn.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. I mean, even in couples therapy, we talk about where you're listening only because you're coming up with your next response. You're not really listening. That's why active listening is when the other person's done expressing it, you should be able to say, now what I've heard you say, and be able to repeat it rather than during the time they're talking, really coming up with your next comeback. Right. And that's a great point. Yeah, we don't want to say that because if we were to back up where we started here, you just listen for a while right here. And then you affirm it by saying you got a lot of, you got good points and there are problems. I mean, this is not a quick get to here. You only get there if they invite you to come to here, to me.
In my arrow may going back to their position.
Right. And yeah, if I'm saying these are valid points, then there's truth over here. There's truth over here, and that may have an influence on how I'm viewing things. You are right. I've never really seen that before, but there is something to be said, right? So I think that's a great point. Yes. So really, if we backed up, it's kind of like until I'm invited to go further, that's all I'm going to do is validate and confess because until they say, well, what do you think? There's no point in going because when you're offering what you think, when they're not interested, you're wasting your time. Right? That's what Jesus says, casting your pearls, right? And I don't see it as a derogatory thing. It's a real life thing that everyone would know. Yeah, don't throw pearls out the pigs. They can't distinguish those between acorns. They'll just eat them up, So he's not calling people pigs. He's using an illustration. So he's not being derogatory. So don't go casting anything out unless they're saying, I am actually interested in what you've got to share. I think that's important.
Greg,
Hang on a second. John David Briggs. Thank you. Go ahead.
So the verse that was coming to my mind that resonates with this is 1 Peter 3:18, the apologetics verse.
Yeah.
But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, always give answer to every you give a reason that it is gentleness and respect those who ask.
Those who ask you. Be ready to give a reason when those who ask you for the hope that's within you. See, sometimes we're like, no, let's go out there and tell them the reason for the hope that's within us, whether they're asking or not. That's what we call Bible bagging, right? That's where people, and they don't enjoy it. It's like these people are so overbearing, right? That's not what Peter envisioned. Yeah, Peter envisioned there'll come a point where they're going to ask, and then you need to be able to say, well, here's my hope. Here's how I put things together in a way that gives me hope, right? This is how, but it's when they ask, and then you still do it with gentleness and meekness of heart, right? This is your meekness. I know I'm at fault. Gentleness is I'm not going there, right? I don't have to go there big time. Gentleness is not pointing out everything wrong with what you're thinking. Gentle, meek, and when they ask, go there. Then you can say, well, here's how I work through those very real issues. Okay.
This appears, at least in my imagination, like with the ground, what does it look like? This appears as though it's very episodic and done with words. And having been going through some of this lately, so I've had conversations with validating their points. Yeah, they do the thing, but then another approach is instead of that top level position, responding with words, I decided that I'm just gonna let my actions talk versus words.
Oh,
And
yeah.
But basically stretch this out instead of just an episode, it's more of a
Right.
long-term conversation of behavior.
Right. No, I think that's very true, because we're always living out, if this is a new vision, we're living out our vision for how to be a follower of Christ. We're living that out 24/7. But we only say anything when someone asks, what's the hope? Then you say something. So our witness is the way we conduct ourselves. And don't get anxious about, well, I'm gonna find a way to tell this person what I'm thinking. No. You wait until they ask. I just think that's so true. I used to be an anxious person who would chase other people, you know, while they're walking away. So I'm trying to catch them. And they're going in another direction. They've got no real interest. They're not coming toward me. So it was through some counseling and stuff, I was told, no, you don't do that. You can only be effective when people are coming towards you. When they turn towards you. So this person was saying, that's why this premarital counseling is just nuts. Because in premarital counseling, they're so in love, this couple. They ain't coming towards you. They're not hearing a word you're saying. They're saying, well, we really need is postmarital counseling, right? When they're ready to listen. Okay, so this isn't going quite as easy as I thought. You got any advice? And it was jokingly so said, but it was true.
Sounds like.
This in love couple is not coming towards you as the pastor who's going to perform their wedding. Everything's going to be great. They're madly in love. They're not listening, right? Because later they'll be willing to listen when it's like, well, this has been harder than I thought. Now they're willing to listen. And that was used as the illustration, the difference between someone going away from you or coming towards you, right? So exactly what I think you're spot on, Ken, is I don't need to be looking for an opportunity to get some words in. And to me, that's what Peter's saying. You live a certain way, and he's talking to Christians living in a non-believing atmosphere, and he's saying, and they're suffering and they're experiencing some persecution. He's just saying, live out the faith, but be ready if someone asks, why are you crazy people doing this? Because somehow their conduct has raised the question, the valid question in someone's mind, why are these people doing this? Then you ought to be ready to say something at that. You've got to be able to articulate what it is that animates your life. Right? But I think you're exactly right. If I'm too anxious about getting the words in, I'm constantly looking for that opportunity rather than waiting for it to come up spontaneous.
I often don't have the word.
Yeah. For a lot of people, you'll gain a lot of credibility as soon as you say, well, I don't know everything here. There's a few people who want you to say you know everything, and they'll have lots of confidence.
But there's not me.
But there's not as many. There's a lot more people who they don't know.
Yeah.
They don't know. And for you to admit you don't know everything is a great affirmation of your own credibility with that.
Right. When I'm talking to Bob, it usually works. I just say, I would agree with you, but that makes us both. When it comes over.
Right. One of the ways that this is mirrors the gracious dialogue, maybe mirrors Christ, is, two observations, Captain Obvious comments, is that there is no ego gratification in valid points to confess faults. In your dialogue,
You'll die to yourself in that. Doing
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
it's not egoic sustainable, if that's a phrase.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
just doesn't give me warm fuzzies. It doesn't support my ego in any way to follow that. It's also, and back to your comments at the beginning, it's also not a very economically viable model, because it doesn't keep social media flowing. It doesn't keep the media flowing. It doesn't keep people, getting jacked up about everything. That's a much more economically viable.
Yeah.
In terms of the attention economy, right? 'Cause
Right.
that gets no attention up there.
Right. Yeah. It might create peace though. right? The first one with the cross arrows, people that cross, you know, they're like ships, we talk about ships passing in the night. They're just on two different tracks. They're not even communicating. I see what's wrong with you, you see what's wrong with me, and we don't even talk in a way that gets to something that we are talking about the same thing. We're talking about two different things. We're at cross odds with each other, right? Conflict, but you're right, you can make money off conflict. I think this would result in the creation of peace. It's a peacemaking way to go about it. But Ken, great point. Yeah, that's dying to yourself to say you're right and here's where I'm wrong, and not to say, but I'm so wrong. But not to say that, to keep that under wraps and to avoid the temptation to assert your own rightness. That's dying to yourself. Because what if they never ask your opinion? You never get to say why you. All the whole thing was you're right and I'm wrong. I died to myself in that, you know. Right?
We don't make them grow.
Exactly. You can't make any. Yeah. That myth that I can get this person from point A to point B. If I can just talk them through it, I can get them there. That's a fallacy. I had lots of Bible studies with people, and I don't know that anyone ever really benefited from it. Back in the day when I had Bible studies, there were argument studies, right?
Yeah.
Nobody ever wanted to become a Christian after my wanting to sit down in their home and talk with them and pull out my scriptures and give them all. Nobody became a Christian. The first, stop here, the first lady who was baptized as a result of Bible studies that we did, they weren't Bible studies. We were knocking doors back in the day, you knocked on doors uninvited. We came across this lady in New Jersey, 3 kids. Her husband was in jail for turning back odometers at the used car dealership. And she had barely any furniture in the house because it had all been on a payment plan and it had all been taken away. So she's in this house with 3 kids, barely any furniture. You know what we did? We didn't have a Bible study. That whole summer, there were 3 of us. We babysat her kids so she could get out and she could get made up and get her hair done and go to the store. She didn't have a car. She didn't have a car, didn't have furniture, didn't have anything. And a nice house. It'd be like a house in Hoover. You know, it wasn't like it was a broken down, you know, it was a nice house, but she has lost everything. We spent that whole summer just ministering to her, Ken's thing. And at the end of the summer, she finally said, so you guys go to a church, right? We hadn't invited her to church. We hadn't asked to open the Bible at the end of the summer. And then she started opening up about her religious past and her experiences. And now it was after we left, I found out from the pastor of that church that she and her husband had become Christians. Right. And I was, you know, and it was like, duh, the only person I didn't study with decided to follow Jesus. And all the people I studied with didn't get there. Right.
Preach everywhere you go, use the words you have.
Yeah. I was not being invited. I was coming in argumentative. I was coming in, where are you a Pentecostal? Here's what's wrong with that. Here's why we're right. You know, you're a Baptist. Here's what's wrong with that. Here's why we're right. I was doing this. Nobody got saved. Right. So if that little illustration resonates with you, that's what we're saying. It never really actually works. Right.
And, you know, there's also an element of humility here.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
We've all got it wrong.
Yeah.
To some extent.
Yeah. So if you start with that admission, I think you start off in a good place. All right. So that's.
My mother was, her father was an elder preacher. I'm sure she gave me all kinds of dogmatic teaching. My most vivid memories of what the things that she would say is, I remember one time we were talking because she grew up in the South and then we moved north. So she was always sort of going through this because she was living with people who were different. And I remember one time, I don't remember what her story was, but she said, you know, I can't prove all of this is true. But the bottom line is I wouldn't want to live any other way. And that has stuck with me more than any of the dogmatic things is she, she was humble and all of that. She couldn't, but it's the way she's chosen to live. That's the way she wants to live. And I thought about that all,
Mm.
I really don't want to live any other way.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll stop here for today. Have fellowship meal coming up next. So if you can stay and eat with us, you're more than welcome to do that.